much.
Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all of our witnesses. Thanks for being with us this evening. I'm looking forward to this study. I think it's going to be of interest to a lot of Canadians. And I'd like to start my questions with Mr. Johnson. What you had to say about this project was very enlightening, particularly all of the twists and turns it's taken since its first iteration. And I'd like to start from the perspective of being a British Columbia MP representing a rural region in the northwest of the province that's thousands of kilometers from here, and has a passenger rail system that is a mere shadow of what it used to be. And when I talk to people about train service or bus service for that matter, so many people talk to me about their vision of having reliable and effective passenger rail service. And yet the current via service through our region is terribly unreliable. It can't be used as basic transportation, only as really a tourist sort of opportunity. And so when we look at this idea of essentially privatizing Canada's busiest passenger rail corridor and the source of some 85% of Via Rail's revenue, we're going to hand all that over, including the conventional Via service along that corridor, to a private company and take it out of Via's hands entirely. It would seem that our public passenger rail provider in this country is going to be left with the guts and feathers of passenger rail. And I'm very concerned about what the fate of rail service in other parts of the country is going to be. Can you, kind of play the tape forward 20 years? What does this look like for Via Rail?
What this looks like is potentially that if the rest of Via Rail continues to be operated as a public service, it needs a very, very much larger subsidy to provide all the core services that are currently shared with the corridor. And that would be, I think, would actually be something that we fear wouldn't actually happen at all, and that you would in fact see trains like the Skeena just disappear, because the government would look at that and say, well, we can't possibly subsidize that. Whereas the original vision of HFR was to triage the corridor, build a strong financial foundation, build from it, be able to look at Calgary-Edmonton, be able to rebuild our long-distance services, be able to support our remote services to northern and indigenous communities. That the surplus of this project, all of the benefits of this project would be for Canadians and would flow back into making our network stronger. And that is our largest concern with this, is that by taking revenue risk and putting it on the table, it's going to cost more. It's going to be years before we even begin to lay any track. And at the end of the day, it's going to cost Canadians more for the same train that we had a blueprint for in 2018 and could have got on with building.
A very stark contrast in those two visions, investing in public rail and the capacity of our public passenger rail provider, and then seeing those benefits across the country versus privatizing the cash cow of passenger rail in Canada and letting the rest of the rail system wither on the branch. If I understand you correctly, those are sort of the two pictures you've painted. But I'd like to turn to another aspect, which is, and this builds on the idea of investing in the capacity of our government and our public passenger rail provision here in Canada. It's rather ironic that the three consortiums that have been selected to compete for this project include a number of rail companies from Europe that are publicly owned. So essentially, other countries have invested in their capacity in terms of public passenger rail and have built up the expertise to the point where we have to pay them to come and build trains in our country. Is that an irony that is accurate?
Actually, it's an irony that people think exists, but isn't even actually accurate. At the moment we have in the GTA, we have On Express partners who've been selected to do co-development for Go Expansion. They are hiring hundreds and hundreds of positions for Canadians. So they're hiring the same people that Metrolinx could have hired directly. And this will be the same here. The Via Rail already worked with Sistra, already worked with the private partners, was already going to work with private construction industries to build the new infrastructure. The only thing that's changed is now operations is on the table. And there's no great secret to doing train operations. And if you want to know how SNCF does something, you pick up a phone. Bonjour, how do you do this thing?
So what you're saying is
there are no trade secrets here. There's a tremendous amount of transparency in this industry because they are all public. Via Rail is perfectly capable of running the service. The building of it was always going to involve the private sector. Projects always do. But the operation doesn't need to be outsourced.
what you're saying essentially is that we have the capacity to a large extent in Canada. We're just going to lose it to the private sector and then have to buy it back at a higher price. Is that?
That would be accurate as to what our fear is about this project.
Okay. Mr. Chair, how many minutes do I have left?
You have 30 seconds left, Mr.
Oh,
Bachrach.
30 seconds. Well, perhaps I'll ask my question and then wait till a future round to hear the answer. But a lot of the concern is around the difference between a public procurement model and these P3 models that this Liberal government seems so entranced by. And, of course, here in Ottawa, residents have some pretty tumultuous experience with the P3 model. And I would just read this quote from the Ottawa LRT inquiry, which noted that the P3 model caused or contributed to several of the ongoing difficulties of the project. So I'm wondering how the experience of the LRT could relate to what we're talking about with this HFR project. And I'll leave the answer for the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The fixation of both Liberal and Conservative governments on public-private partnerships has always seemed a bit more of an ideological fixation rather than being based on an objective evaluation. And we have the Auditors General of both British Columbia and Ontario who analyzed dozens of P3 projects and found that they're more likely to cost taxpayers more and run behind schedule. So I'm really fascinated by the decision making to go with this model for the HFR project. And our research shows that the government analyzed 20 different Canadian and international transportation projects when assessing procurement options. None of those 20 used public procurement models. And I'm wondering to Mr. Imblo, I understand that he's new in the position. Why does he think that is? Not a single one.
Well, first, I have to be humble about the fact that we inherited of a mandate to do a procurement process that was decided by other authorities. So I respect that decision. That being said, to the risk of repeating myself, having the mix of building the intelligence and the expertise internally while relying on the expertise of the private sector and the innovation, in this case, we think is the right approach.
And to Mr. Johnson, if we were to look around the world and if we could go back in time and have the government do a fair analysis of rail projects that have been publicly procured versus ones that have been privately procured, where would we look for public examples?
That's actually a good question. But I just wanted to make one thing clear. We're not opposed to the private sector. We are opposed to getting this wrong. We want to be very, very pragmatic about this. One of the lessons of the Ottawa LRT project is that the public partner wasn't sufficiently sophisticated. So actually it's very good that we have very skilled people being brought into the VRHFR team to hold the public part of this project down. But the thing is that, and the original plan was a public-private partnership, but one for infrastructure, one that would be an availability payment-based project for the infrastructure. So those are quite common. Totally outsourcing your entire railway isn't very common. In fact, the only the only equivalent I can think of is the deal that the Indonesians have just done with China for the HSR. But you could compare, for example, with what India has done, building its domestic capability.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. You had 15 seconds left. I don't know if you...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to pick up where my colleague, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, left off talking about mode share and travel times between major centres. I met with Via Rail a couple years ago before the second iteration of the terms of reference were released and when they were still in charge of the project. And they said very clearly to me that they intended to compete with car trips between major centers, but that competing and stealing market share from short-haul flights was not on the table. They weren't interested in that. Now, there's some research from the OECD, and this is out of France, that showed, and I'll just read a quote from it. Once the journey time by rail exceeds the journey time by air by 1 to 2 hours, the market share drops to about 50% and decreases rapidly thereafter. So I'm wondering if now that higher speeds, at least on portions of the route, is on the table, whether this objective of reducing short-haul flights between major centers is going to be brought into the project as a key objective.
I'm not sure if it will be a key objective, but I think it will be a side benefit because I consider myself, if the train takes me Toronto, Montreal in 4 hours, definitely I will use the train every time because the delays and the certainty of being reliable and on time. So directionally speaking, it will probably increase the usage of the.
And I don't fly Toronto, Montreal a lot, but in your view, would the HFR project deliver what this study says is necessary to capture that market share, not just from rail enthusiasts like yourself, but from people who are going to take the easiest and most economical option?
And again, it's going to be a personal one. I'm not necessarily a rail fanatic because I didn't use it before because it was not the service I was expecting. So if it's 4 hours between Toronto and Montreal, I will use the train all the time. So I'm expecting the business community at least to change their habit, drop the cars, drop the plane, and use the train.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach, and I agree with Mr. Badaway. That is a good line and a good slogan. You might want to take that down.